Hey everybody, welcome to TCP Talks with Jonathan Baker and Justin Brodley from the Cloud Pod. In this series, we're bringing you interviews with the best and brightest leaders and heroes from the tech and cloud industry. On today's show, we chat to Liz Rice, VP of Open Source Engineering with Aqua Security. She's also the chair of the Cncf Technical Oversight Committee and AWS Container Hero.
Well, Liz, thanks for joining us here on TCP Talks. Maybe you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. So my name's Liz Rice. I am VP of Open Source Engineering at Aqua Security. And Aqua is a company that provides tools to help enterprises secure their cloud-native deployments. So we have open source tools that my team build that complement that or get built into the commercial products. And then I also have a kind of side role of being the chair of the Technical Oversight Committee at the Cncf.
Awesome. Well, we're super happy to have you here on the show. And, it's been an interesting journey for Aqua. Originally very focused on containers. They've now bought CloudSploit. They've gotten a lot more active in the open source community, partially because of you, I'm sure. But what's kind of been the journey for AquaSec, and where kind of have you seen the market change as you guys have adapted and met the needs?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I've been with Aqua for, quite a bit over 3 years now. And I remember when I first joined, containers were really new to a lot of people. Hardly anybody was running them in any kind of scale in production. We were still very much in the midst of orchestration wars. So there were 3 or 4 different choices for orchestrators, and there was so much complexity. I think a lot of the choice has been made simpler for end user companies, so they can adopt things like Kubernetes is pretty much the de facto orchestrator that most people are going to choose now. We don't really have to explain what containers are anymore. We get a lot fewer people sort of thinking that it's anything to do with actually physical locks on a big box that goes on board a ship. There's a lot more understanding of what we do. But then it's also become a much more, I guess, there's more competition, there's more technology out there, there's more tools that you can apply to secure cloud native. There's more to know. It's become maybe bigger. And also, the hype of the whole cloud native world is, maybe 3 years ago we were thinking, wow, this is amazing. These container things, they're really popular. And now it's just huge.
It's interesting. I think we're actually maybe a little bit in the trough of disillusionment a little bit on containers and Kubernetes in general and the complexities of those things. And so I think that's kind of the next big evolution of Kubernetes is really the simplification of it. I think we built a really powerful tool, and that's really helpful. And for the companies that can afford to hire a Kubernetes team to manage it and care and feed for it, that's really great. But I think we're at this point where companies are realizing that's really expensive. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of the next year or two how the community starts to really address that issue and really start simplifying a lot of this stuff. And do we continue to see things like COPS and other things that simplify the story, or do we continue to see the vendors really take on the main role of this between VMware, Tanzu, and AWS and GCP and what they're all doing in their spaces? What do you think about that?
I particularly think we'll see quite a lot of new developments in the world of developer experience. So making it easier, for developers today, they kind of have to know an awful lot more about YAML and how their pods are going to get deployed than they probably really need to. They need to be focusing on business logic and functionality for their users, and I think we will see some abstractions that allow them to focus on that and not have to be Kubernetes experts in order to write cloud-native apps. And one of the reasons why I think that will happen is because we're seeing more and more end users, quite often big companies, who are joining the CNCF, and they're coming to all the kind of community meetings, and they're bringing their problems and their solutions with them. And quite a lot of those problems and solutions have been about, okay, how do we enable our developer organization to adopt this technology?
What new challenges do containers bring in terms of security?
I think a big part of it relates to automation. So the scale of workloads that you're running, in the olden days, you would be running a VM with some software on it, and you might have a set of those VMs, but they're basically managed by humans. And now we're talking about those VMs running thousands of different containers, and the containers are, being created and destroyed dynamically all the time, and they're being redeployed much, much, much more frequently. And I think that speed at which the software changes means you can't be expecting to run kind of manual security processes to keep up with that. You have to have automation. So a lot of the container security tooling and cloud native tooling is really about doing things like scanning automatically, putting automated gates in, putting automated alerts in, and just enabling the operation at scale that we see with containers and cloud native.
Do you think it's too late to be scanning for security vulnerabilities by the time something's already in production?
I think you have to keep scanning. I think you have to be scanning the whole lifetime of that image. We want to be pushing scanning as far left in the life cycle so that developers can ship hopefully secure images. But even while it's running in production, your container I think the average lifetime of a container is about 3 days, but, the underlying code might last for a lot longer than that. And a new vulnerability could be discovered at any time. So you have to be scanning repeatedly in case new vulnerabilities have been uncovered. And they come up all the time.
Mm-hmm. It's a bit of a misnomer I think people have that, they're like, oh, containers are less secure. And that's why you need to continually scan them in all these different places. I'm like, it's no different than an EC2 instance or a VM where, we're running Qualys agents or we're running some other things. So they all rot in their own ways. The beauty of containers, though, in my mind, is that if you built the pipeline correctly, you built the automation right, you're actually able to drive better security and better compliance against those vulnerabilities and that rot that happens over time much, much faster in a much more scalable way. So in a lot of ways, it's a lot of the Web 2.0 thinking that we had, back at the early days of the Velocity conference, where, we're talking about, Chef and Puppet and all these things. And now containers are this much simpler abstraction of all of that, which is really great. So it's really nice to see that thinking and really thinking through how we approach container security in a different way, but also in the very similar to the way we used to do it in the past.
And I think it's when you talk about the kind of rot and the way that software tends to just sort of drift away from the original state that we intended our deployment to be in. And that can still happen in a containerized world, but a lot of the tooling steers us away from that. A lot of the, we're very much discouraging people now from SSHing into host machines. You're supposed to be using your kube control or your dashboards or whatever to be manipulating the pods that are running in your cluster. You're not supposed to be in there touching them directly. And the whole cattle not pets treatment of the underlying machines, let's blow away machines from time to time and recreate them so we know that they started from a good state in the first place. It's not really anything, well, it is kind of something new, but we're dealing with the same software, but we're able to kind of keep it in that, stop it from drifting because we're using these processes and the automation to keep recreating the state that we want.
Yeah, it's interesting because containers is just one part of that whole ecosystem. And, with your acquisition of CloudSploit last year, you guys have now brought it into the cloud security posture management space. How do you see those two pieces kind of coming together and interacting with each other in a way that's really interesting?
Yeah, it feels to me like a very natural progression. And we started with containers. Pretty quickly, we were also looking at serverless, securing your Lambda and similar functions. Increasingly, people were saying, but what about the host? How can we make sure the host is secure? So we were kind of moving down the stack, if you like, that direction. And once you're looking at the configuration of the host and the software that's running on the host, you may as well also be looking at the configuration of that host within its cloud, within the settings that the cloud provider gives you. So CloudSploit was a very kind of complementary, they're coming from that, the configuration of your cloud settings. And that just sort of meshes really naturally with what we've been doing on the kind of host side, including things that my team had been doing with things like KubeBench for checking your Kubernetes settings were according to best practice. So it meshes together really nicely in that whole kind of securing everything in the stack.
As VP of open source technology, what is it about the open source solutions that's of value to Aqua? They could be closed source about everything. So what is it that open source brings to them as a benefit?
So if we think about the cloud native world, so much of the technology that we're working with is it's open source. We're Kubernetes and Docker, we're Moby project anyway. All of those kind of surrounding projects like Prometheus and gRPC and, the dozens of others that are in the CNCF and others that are outside the CNCF as well. So much of this technology is open source. And so we know that our enterprise customers are using open source software, and they're quite often participating in the community discussions that go along with that. I mean, cloud native is, I think one of the really special things about cloud native is how engaged the community is and how you can just go out and find the answers to your questions by talking to people. So as a business, we have to be there. We have to be where the discussions are, and having open source tools and solutions that are genuinely useful gives us a good way of participating in that community. And, for every 1,000 people that use one of our open source tools, some proportion of them, they might be working for an enterprise that then turns out to also have enterprise needs that they're familiar with Aqua, maybe they know who we are, and we have a connection with them already. So that was really why we wanted to move in that direction, and it's been super successful. It also helps us kind of explore technology ideas. So we just this week, or last week rather, launched a new project called Starboard. And the idea of Starboard is to make security information available across the Kubernetes API in a very sort of native way. And, I think it's a really great idea. I couldn't tell you how we could sort of monetize that idea today, but I do think it has value. So we can, as an open source project, get people trying it out. They can, give us feedback on it. We can evolve it into something useful. But ultimately, it joins into both open source and commercial security tools. So there will be a bridge between that project and our commercial products, potentially other people's commercial projects as well. But, it will give people a way of, if they have projects that can't be solved with open source tools, again, they know who we are. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, so maybe you can expand a little bit about Starboard and kind of what it's doing in the Kubernetes space. People are familiar with some of your other tools like Trivy and KubeHunter and some of those. How does this particularly apply to those, and what are we really getting out of this solution? Why should I be super excited to sell some of my Kubernetes cluster today?
So Trivy would be a great example. You can run Trivy and point Trivy at a container image. We can actually now support pointing it at GitHub repos as well. So you point it at the thing that you want it to scan, and it will tell you whether there are vulnerabilities. What Starboard's doing is bringing that information into the Kubernetes world. So one of the subcommands that we have in Starboard is find vulnerabilities. And what that does is run a job to scan. You find vulnerabilities in a particular deployment, or job or what have you. Under the covers, Starboard will look up what's the images that are used in that deployment, runs Trivy over those images, and then presents the information back to you as Kubernetes custom resources. So then you can query over the API. The CRDs are labeled up with information about like the name of the deployment and the namespace and what have you, so that we can match up. These are the vulnerabilities that apply to this, instance of Nginx running in your default namespace or what have you. And then you can query them over the API. And we have a nice Octant plugin. If you've seen Octant, it's a really nice dashboard for Kubernetes. Pluggable, which is fantastic for being able to extend it with things like, here are your vulnerabilities. Here are the vulnerabilities right next to or displayed as part of the information about the workload that they apply to. It was a very long-winded explanation of saying you can run Trivy through Starboard and your results are right there next to the workload you're interested in.
That's really great, because one of the challenges I have with a lot of security tools is that they become their own isolated pillars where the data's there, it's all really great, security team's aware of it, but the dev team doesn't have access to it, or the ops team doesn't have access to it. So being able to unify those dashboards and being able to show that security vulnerability next to monitoring data versus the Kubernetes runtime, I think that's really great. So I'm all about democratizing IT and all these different pillars and saying that data should be just as important to the engineering team as it is to the security team. So I'm super excited about this. This is really great.
One of the design partners, I'll say, one of our customers that we kind of ran the early ideas past, and they were super excited about it because exactly what you're saying, they wanted to get that security information, give it or make it accessible to the developers, but they didn't want to give them access to the security tools. And they were basically saying, I just want to use Kubernetes RBAC to limit who has access to that security information. So if you can put that in the namespace and I can give them information to that, make it accessible over that API that they're already using, great. I don't have to worry about exposing a whole new tool to them and whatever other concerns I might have about doing that.
I know that a lot of people are still learning a lot about security, and you've written a fantastic book on container security, recently with O'Reilly. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, the book and kind of what you'll learn from the book and why people should go out and buy it today.
Yeah, so I guess for quite a few years now, I've been doing talks fairly frequently, conference talks, and writing blogs and what have you about containers and security. And I eventually wanted to kind of take that material and just dive a little bit more in depth. I very much didn't want to do just like here is a guide to the actions you need to take to secure your containers. I want to explain why you have to take those actions. I want to give people the reasoning, the understanding, what's happening when you run a container, what's actually inside that container image, when you run these security tools, what's really happening, so that people can understand whether or not that security is necessary for them. There's been loads of cases over the last few years where people have exposed their deployment in some way just through not really understanding what they're doing, exposing the Kubernetes dashboard to the internet or running containers as root without realizing that that's what they're doing. And if I can use the book to explain what's really happening when you're using the sort of underlying technology, hopefully that gives people a mental model for the security that they need to apply in their particular application. It is about security, but it's also about the underlying technology and how that influences what is or isn't secure when you're running containers.
And I'm sure it's also about people and making sure you understand the security and the priority of that security in the system too.
Can you talk a little bit about the CNCF and its role?
Yeah, so the CNCF, for anyone who doesn't already know this, it stands for CloudNative Computing Foundation, and it's the organization that owns Kubernetes and various other projects, Prometheus, gRPC, FluentD, dozens of other projects. And the idea is that really it's a neutral ground where all these different organizations who are interested in cloud native can get together and collaborate in a place where all these different organizations can come together and collaborate on these projects that we're now really very reliant on. But it is fantastic in that, you genuinely see projects from all the kind of, major cloud providers, vendors. They all have these interests in these projects. And the only way to kind of make it, let's say, safe for everyone to participate as an organization is to have it held by a neutral organization. CNCF is part of the Linux Foundation. So it's very much along the same model as Linux, that the foundation owns the intellectual property, facilitates the ability to collaborate on projects. It also organises things like KubeCon, CloudNativeCon. So there's a kind of giant marketing side to what the CNCF does and awareness raising of what's happening in cloud native. But it's also about enabling people to collaborate on these different projects, so that people can come together and figure out how they're going to make Kubernetes, let's say, more secure, for example. Interested groups of people can come together, set up a working group or a SIG or whatever is the appropriate group, and work on, or a project, and work on it together collaboratively.
I know you've been involved with them for a long time. What's your current role?
So right now I am chair of the Technical Oversight Committee, and that is the body that essentially decides which projects can be part of the CNCF and what level of maturity they're at. So projects might come in at a sandbox stage because they're very experimental, or they might, we have a large body of projects in incubation where they're on a pretty good path. We like to talk about the kind of, the maturity cycle where, maybe sandbox projects are for early adopters, and, by the time you get to graduated projects, we're really saying that's kind of early majority, ready for mass adoption.
What about some of the recent, noise in the space around Google maybe being upset about giving away Kubernetes? There's been some angst about Istio and potentially Knative not getting adopted, and I think they just recently came out and said they will adopt Knative, which is good, but still haven't provided a timeline. How does that kind of affect the CNCF and your kind of the overall mission of the organization?
The difficulties are really around confusion for end users. So end users will come to the CNCF to learn about cloud native, and if they want to learn about, let's say, service mesh, we have the difficult job of explaining, well, we can't tell you, what maturity level Istio is because it's not part of the CNCF, and that's not necessarily something that end users expect. And, we can't make any... One of the things that we do with these different maturity levels is look at what level of open governance, what level of contribution from different organizations there are, and we can only do that for projects that are part of the organization. So it makes things confusing for end users when they come and ask questions if they're not part of the foundation, particularly because quite often even community members are surprised to discover that some of these projects aren't part of the CNCF. So that's really the reason why it would be lovely if they were all in one place. I think people want these projects to be in a foundation so that they know that the project has its own life. It has it's not tied to the fortunes of any particular company or to the strategy of any particular company, but the project can carry on. So this is one of the great things about Kubernetes and why it's been adopted so widely, because Google today contribute tons of time and energy and engineering hours into Kubernetes. They have done ever since it was, first started, and they continue to do so. If tomorrow they were to decide they were going to walk away, Kubernetes still exists, and it will do so because of the CNCF and all the other participants. It would clearly be a difficult time if Google turned off the tap tomorrow, but it would be. It doesn't mean that anyone who's relying on Kubernetes, they don't need to worry about Google's strategy going forward. And I think that's the reason why a lot of end users would like to see other projects also being part of the foundation.
How do you feel the recent change of Dan Cohn to Priyanka Sharma, taking over leadership of CNCF? How do you think that strengthens the organization and really moves it to the next steps of its existence?
I've known Priyanka for quite a few years now, and she's been, part of the CNCF community for several years, and she's been on the governing board. She's very familiar with the organisation, and she's seen it from different roles. So I think it's going to be fantastic. I think because it's someone who's come from the community, I think she'll have the trust of the community. She understands things from the vendor's perspective, so I think she'll have the trust of the vendors. I think it's a fantastic beginning to the next chapter for the CNCF. She's going to usher in a new era of kind of collaboration and community. CNCF has always been about community, and I think she'll sort of refresh that sense of we are all in this together. We're all going through a heck of a year. where lots of people are struggling with many things. And one of the nice things about the CNCF has always been its diversity and its welcoming nature. And I think Priyanka will just build on that, and we'll see it go from strength to strength.
All right, you'll probably move this in the order just because I should have asked it earlier. But we typically ask all of our guests how they feel about multi-cloud. What's your definition of multi-cloud, and how do you see multi-cloud in the world today?
So the fact that you're asking me what my definition of multi-cloud is makes me think, there's a wrong answer, and I might,
there is no real wrong answer. I mean, there's an answer that we feel is the right answer at the Cloud Pod, but we always like to see what people think and kind of what their take on it is, and we can talk about it if it's different. But we find that most people actually share our viewpoint, so we'll see.
Yeah. So I guess one way of answering that question is, for an end user, multi-cloud is an attempt to avoid vendor lock-in and attempt to give themselves future flexibility, which I think there is a level at which that's super important, because you don't want to tie your fortunes necessarily to one particular platform. At another level, I think for a lot of organizations, particularly small organizations, it's just going to be cheaper and easier to take advantage of things that managed services can do for you. And that may mean adopting a particular cloud's provision of those services. I think Lambda would be a really great example. Whichever of the clouds you used, whatever their functions interface is, you're going to be a bit tied to that if you're going to use serverless functions. But it may be a price worth paying to do something quick and easy if you're particularly a small organization or in need of doing something quick.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the lock-in. I think I've been publicly stated now by Amazon in a quote somewhere, because I said I feel every technology choice we make is a form of lock-in, right? If you choose Java or you choose .NET, that's a lock-in, right? I've now chosen a camp. And so I don't see the risk of lock-in of choosing something like Lambda if that's my cloud provider. I don't see the risk of choosing Aurora or DynamoDB, or even on Google side, choosing some of their products around BigQuery. Like those are lock-in choices I'm making because they bring business productivity and they bring value to the business. And a lot of times, you're talking about 6 months to a year to get out of a choice like that. A foundational choice like .NET or Java may take much longer, but at least the high level abstractions we're seeing in the cloud, those aren't that expensive of lock-ins in my take today. But it's definitely an interesting challenge that we see out there, is that people are really worried about lock-in, and I think it's really more about leverage of the vendor than it is about actually concerned about lock-in. But we'll see. So what I was kind of asking about the multi-cloud. A lot of people see lowest common denominator cloud, and Kubernetes as being the engine that drives that. I have an application that I can take from Azure, and I can run it on Google, and I can run it on AWS, depending on who's giving me the best price this moment. There's that camp of people who are kind of in that side of it. And then there's people who see right cloud, right solution, right problem. And so they use the right cloud for that particular use case. And that's kind of where we're seeing there's a division of people who kind of fall between those two camps.
That makes sense. There's definitely features that certain cloud providers, shine at, and just familiarity as well. People are if you have a group of people in your organization who are already super familiar with one cloud, then that's doing something else will have a cost. So you may want to leverage the skills you have.
Why do you think Kubernetes won against other orchestration platforms? Because it's in itself, it's an incredibly complex mess of tooling, and I wouldn't have thought from the outside that it would have been the success that it was.
I think there are lots of different factors coming into it, but I actually genuinely think the CNCF and the neutrality of it was a huge part of it. That end users could look at this technology and say, but this is what Google are using, but I don't have to buy it from there. And there are all these other companies who are all getting involved. So, basically whichever organizations you respect in technology, they were all getting involved. So must be something good about it.
Well, Well, it's nice to see a lot of the government agencies now saying that, hey, if it's not part of a foundation that keeps this stuff open, we're not going to use it in our decision, in our technology stacks, which is really a change. I think if you talk about 10, 15 years ago, it was Oracle and SAP and big vendors all the time, and that was the only way they would buy software. And now we're saying no, if it's locked down by a single vendor, I'm not interested in it. And that's a completely different shift in the market that I think Cncf has really brought to the table, which is great.
It's fantastic to see this. I just saw in the last couple of weeks there's the US Department of Defense are opening up some cloud-native security requirement documentation. They're building this documentation in the open and getting feedback from the community, and the community is absolutely full of experts, so they will get a really rounded solution, I think, by opening up like that. So yeah, it's fantastic. And I think particularly for kind of government organizations, the fact that people can see what their publicly funded organizations are doing and what their government organisations are doing is terrific. We had a whole thing in the UK around the government digital service where they, it's quite a few years ago now, but they had this policy of, unless there's a really good reason not to, we will publish all of our kind of decision making and all of our kind of technical reviews and everything. And it was a real game changer for the way that digital services were implemented in the government. So this move to do things openly, I think, is terrific.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Well, if people would like to check out your book and your blog and all of the great content you're putting out on the web, where could they follow you in the interweb?
So I am Liz Rice on Twitter. That's probably where I hang out the most, and probably find me. I mean, also AquaSec team on Twitter, Aqua Security on LinkedIn, aquasec.com. LizRice.com is my own website. Yeah.
And if you want to check out the information about Starboard, I found the blog over on the Aqua Sec blog.
Oh, I should have mentioned, the Aqua Security GitHub repo, or repos. So we have a whole collection. We have a significant number of projects up there now. Some of them are private, but we've got quite a few projects in the works on the GitHub repo. Some of them come out of our sort of integrations, as well as kind of projects that come directly out of my team. But there's lots going on.
That's great. Yeah, my day job, we chose Aqua many years ago, and we've been very happy with that solution. So it's been fantastic.
Excellent. Yes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for coming on to the show. We love talking with you, and thanks for your insights on container security and the CNCF and all that. It's really great. The listeners will love it. And thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Visit thecloudpod.net to subscribe to the show, join our Slack channel, or sign up for our weekly newsletter. You can also find information on reaching our audience through a CloudPod sponsorship opportunity. A big thank you to today's guest, and thank you for listening.